Over the years, I'd learned that some silences say more than any conversation ever could. That silence was screaming. Finally, he lifted his head. My wife says she doesn't feel anything for me anymore. I waited. Experience had taught me that people almost never begin with what's truly important. The important part always comes a few seconds later. John took a deep breath. 30 years together. And one morning she woke up, looked at me, and told me she'd been living for years with a man she no longer loved. He tried to smile, but it wasn't a smile. It was the final effort of someone who had spent far too long trying not to fall apart. Then he looked at me and asked, "Do you know what the worst part is?" I slowly shook my head. Every morning. I still drink my coffee from the mug she gave me 17 years ago, and every single day I expect to hear her footsteps coming down the stairs, but they never come. The house still makes the same sounds. The refrigerator still hums. The clock keeps ticking. The neighbors still walk their dog at exactly the same time. Everything is exactly the same, and everything except her. Those weren't the words of an angry man. They were the words of a man who was completely lost. Then he asked me the same question I'd heard hundreds of times throughout my career. "Dr. Jamata, tell me the truth. How long does it take to stop loving someone?" I didn't answer, because that wasn't the real question, and it was only the question he believed he was supposed to ask. I opened a notebook, wrote down a single word: emptiness. John leaned forward, trying to read it. "What does that mean?" he asked. I closed the notebook. "I don't know yet." He frowned. "What do you mean you don't know?" I looked at him for a few seconds. "Because I still don't know what you've actually lost." His answer came instantly. "I lost my wife." I slowly shook my head. "That's what you think, but I'm not convinced. That's what you really lost." For the first time since walking into my office, John stopped acting like an abandoned husband. Now he looked at me like a man beginning to suspect that maybe he'd spent the last 3 months asking the wrong questions. "I don't understand," he said. "I know," I replied, "and that's exactly why you're here." He took a long breath, rested his elbows on his knees, and then said only one word. "Go on." I studied him for a few moments. Then I said something I'd never said before, and something I would never say again in exactly the same way. "John, I think you spent the last 3 months looking for answers to the wrong question." His expression changed. "Then what's the right question?" I held his gaze. "You shouldn't be asking why your wife stopped loving you. You should be asking why you needed her to never stop." He stared at me in silence. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "Okay." I nodded. "Thank you for telling me that." He looked confused. "Because," I continued, "you've just made a decision that I believe is the right one." John never took his eyes off me. There was something unusual in them, but it wasn't sadness. I'd seen sadness hundreds of times before. This was different. It was the look of a man beginning to suspect that his entire life might have been built on a false belief. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. I wasn't in a hurry. Experience had taught me that the most important questions need silence before they can grow. Finally, John spoke. "Doctor, if you're right, does that mean I was never really in love with my wife?" I slowly shook my head. "No, that's not what I'm saying." Relief washed across his face, but only for a moment. Because then I added, "What I'm questioning isn't your love. What I'm questioning is the story you've been telling yourself about that love for the past 3 months. He frowned. He still didn't understand. I stood up, walked over to a small shelf, picked up 2 glasses and filled them with water. I offered him one, and he didn't take it. His hands were busy, and one was gripping his wedding ring. The other was trying to hide its trembling. I sat back down. "John, I want to ask you something, but I need you to answer without thinking." He nodded. "When you first met your wife, what was the very first thing you noticed about her?" His answer came instantly. "She was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen." I smiled. "That's your eyes answering, and now I want your soul to answer." He froze. For the first time since he had walked into my office, he had no prepared response, so I waited. An impatient therapist gets quick answers. A patient therapist gets honest ones. Almost a full minute passed. Finally, he spoke so quietly I almost didn't hear him. "She made me feel safe." Those 4 words changed the entire conversation, not because they were extraordinary, but because I'd heard them before, and not exactly those words, but the same meaning. Suddenly, I remembered another patient, Sarah. The first time she walked into my office, she was holding a handkerchief tightly between her fingers. As she spoke, she twisted it without even realizing she was doing it. I'll never forget the very first sentence she said. "Doctor, I don't understand how someone can stop admiring you overnight." She didn't talk about love. She didn't talk about betrayal, and she talked about admiration. That caught my attention. Because whenever someone tells one story, but all the emotion appears while talking about something else. You listen to the emotion, not the story, Sarah continued. "I stood by him after he lost his job. I took care of his father when he became ill. I gave up my career to raise our children. I never stopped being there for him." Then her voice became softer, almost a whisper. "So, how could he stop choosing me?" That question stayed with me, not because I was looking for an answer, but because it was hiding another question, one that ran much deeper. I looked back at John. He was still waiting. "You know what I'm thinking, don't you?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "Yes, I think you're beginning to realize that for months you've been talking about your wife, when in reality, you've been talking about yourself." John lowered his head, and for the first time since he entered my office, he didn't try to defend himself, and he simply sat there, silent, the way people do when the truth begins, very slowly, to find its way inside them. That night, after John left my office, I couldn't stop thinking about one word: refuge. It wasn't just another word, and it was the word he'd spoken without realizing it. Over the years, I'd learned that the most important words are almost never the ones patients choose consciously. They're the ones that escape them. For a long time, I believed people were looking for a partner. Today, I'm no longer so sure, and I think that very often, what they're really searching for is a place where they no longer have to be afraid. And those are 2 very different things. The following week, John came back. He walked in much more slowly than he had the first time. His face still looked exhausted. But the anger he'd arrived with during that first session was gone. He sat down, waited for a few moments, then said something I wasn't expecting. "Doctor, I've spent the whole week thinking about one question." I didn't answer. I knew he needed to hear himself say it. What if my wife was never really the problem? The moment he said those words, I was reminded of another patient, and his name was Mark. He was an engineer, 32 years old, brilliant at work, a complete disaster when it came to relationships. The very first thing he said after sitting down was, "Doctor, I think the universe has something personal against you. I smiled. And why do you think that? Because I always fall in love with the wrong woman. I asked him how many serious relationships he'd had. 4. And did they all end badly? He nodded. Every single one. I opened my notebook, wrote down one question, then turned it toward him. He read it aloud. What did all 4 women have in common? He answered immediately. Nothing. They were completely different. One was a lawyer, another was a teacher, and another was an architect, and the last one owned a coffee shop. I slowly shook my head. I didn't ask what they did for a living. I asked what they had in common. He fell silent. Almost 2 minutes passed. Finally, he looked up. I don't know. I smiled. That's the smartest thing you've said since you walked in. He looked at me, surprised. I continued. Because the moment someone says, I don't know, they finally make room to discover something new. I closed the notebook. Now I'm going to ask you another question, I said. But I don't want you to answer it quickly. I want you to feel it. Mark nodded. When you met the first woman, what disappeared inside you whenever you were with her? His eyes immediately dropped to the floor. He didn't answer. I waited. Over the years, I'd learned that a therapist should never fear silence. Silence isn't empty. It's the place where real answers are born. Almost a full minute passed. Then he finally spoke, very quietly. When I was with her, I stopped feeling like I wasn't enough. A chill ran through me, not because those words were new, but because I'd heard them before. John had said, when I was with her, I felt important. Sarah had said, when I was with him, I felt valuable. And now Mark was saying, when I was with her, I stopped feeling like I wasn't enough. 3 people, 3 different lives, 3 completely different stories, yet all describing exactly the same need. At that moment, I still didn't have the answer, but I began to suspect something. Maybe none of them had fallen in love. Only with another person, maybe. They had also fallen in love with the version of themselves that only seemed to exist when they were with that person. Let me say that again. They had fallen in love with the version of themselves that appeared when they were together. That thought wouldn't leave me alone. It followed me everywhere, while I was driving, while I was reading, while I was walking home. Because if that idea was true, then thousands of people weren't crying because they'd lost someone. They were crying because they'd lost an identity. An identity they had never learned to build on their own. And it was precisely then that Allison walked into my office, the woman who would permanently destroy everything I thought I knew about love. Allison arrived on a Thursday afternoon. She wasn't crying. That was the first thing that caught my attention. Most people walk into therapy after a breakup, with tears filling their eyes, and not Allison. She walked in, completely empty. She sat down slowly, placed her purse on the floor, looked around the room as though searching for the right words, and then she took a deep breath. Doctor, I think I have a very serious problem. I waited. She looked down at her hands, and then she said something I'd never heard before. I'm not sure I ever truly loved my husband. That sentence caught me completely off guard. For years, I'd listened to people say, my husband stopped loving me. My wife cheated on me. She abandoned me. But I'd never heard someone question their own love. I stayed silent. She continued. When we met, I was going through the darkest period of my life. My mother had just died. My father had been seriously ill for months. I felt completely alone. And then he appeared. As she spoke, I noticed something curious. Every time she mentioned her husband's name, She smiled, but it wasn't the smile of someone remembering the love of her life. It was the smile of someone remembering the place where they once felt safe. My curiosity grew. What was the first thing you saw in him? She answered almost instantly. Peace. She didn't say he was handsome. She didn't say he was brilliant. She didn't even say he was funny. Just one word, peace. I wrote it down in my notebook and then I looked back at her. Tell me about that peace. She remained silent for several seconds. Finally, she whispered, when I was with him, I stopped being afraid. The moment she said those words, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. John had said, she made me feel important. Mark had said, I stopped feeling like I wasn't enough. And now Allison was saying, I stopped being afraid. These weren't different stories. They were the same story, told by different people, she continued. For the first few years, I believed I'd found the perfect man. We never argued. He never raised his voice. He was always there whenever I needed him. I thought that was love. I looked at her carefully. And when did everything begin to change? She let out a long sigh. That's the thing. He didn't change. I did. Those words hung in the air between us. They weren't what I expected. Almost everyone comes into therapy convinced that the other person changed. Allison wasn't blaming him. She was looking at herself. Tell me what you mean. She lowered her eyes. Over the years, I became stronger. I found work that I truly loved. I learned how to be alone. I realized I could make decisions without asking anyone's permission. And little by little, without even noticing, I stopped needing someone to protect me. She paused, the longest pause since the session had begun. Then she quietly added, that's when I started wondering whether I was still in love or whether I had simply stopped needing what he represented. She looked out the window for a moment. Then she smiled faintly. And something an old friend once told me suddenly came back to me. When a blind person finally learns to see, the first thing they stop needing is the cane that once guided them. I didn't answer, because for the first time in many years, I wasn't the one teaching, I was the one learning. I stood up, slowly walked toward the window. People believe therapists always have the answers. They don't. Some days, a patient forces you to tear down an idea you've spent 20 years believing. That Thursday was one of those days. As I looked out at the street below, I thought about John, I thought about Mark, and I thought about Sarah, and suddenly, a question appeared that had never crossed my mind before. What if at the beginning of every relationship, we don't actually see the other person as they are? What if what we really see is the answer we believe we've found to our own fears? I turned back toward Allison. She was still waiting. I asked her one final question, a question that would forever change the way I understood relationships. Allison, if you had met the exact same man, but you had already been confident, fearless, independent, and had never needed anyone to protect you, do you think you would have fallen in love with him? Allison closed her eyes. She didn't answer. Almost a minute passed. When she finally opened them again, there were tears. But they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of understanding. She slowly shook her head. No. I think I would have admired him. I think I would have liked him. But I wouldn't have fallen in love. Her answer left me completely still, and because I realized I had just heard one of the most honest confessions of my entire career. That evening, after locking my office, I opened my personal journal, not Allison's file, my own, and I wrote a single sentence. Sometimes we don't fall in love with the person standing in front of us. We fall in love with the silent promise that they will rescue us from ourselves. For a long time, I believed that sentence explained love. I was wrong. It explained the beginning of love, not love itself, because genuine love doesn't begin when someone fills your emptiness. It begins when there's no emptiness left to fill. That realization stayed with me for weeks, until another patient walked into my office. Her name was Laura. She was 43 years old, a literature professor, brilliant, the kind of intelligence that sometimes makes people uncomfortable. The moment she sat down, she looked straight at me and said, "Doctor, no, I don't think my husband changed. I think he was never the man I imagined." That sentence immediately caught my attention. "What do you mean?" She smiled, almost embarrassed. "When we first met, every little thing he did seemed extraordinary. If he arrived 5 minutes early, I thought he was the most thoughtful man I'd ever met. If he wrote me a letter, I believed he was incredibly romantic. If he talked about his dreams, I convinced myself he was deeply profound." She paused, then she smiled again. "Today, I know all of those things were true. But I also know I added many things that were never really there." I quietly closed my notebook. I didn't need to write anymore. I needed to listen. Laura continued. "As the years went by, I discovered he could be proud. He avoided conflict. He struggled to apologize. And whenever something hurt him, he retreated into himself. And then I started repeating the same sentence. 'You've changed.'" She smiled sadly. Until one day, I realized maybe he hadn't changed very much. Maybe I'd simply stopped imagining him. Those words stayed with me for months, because without realizing it, Laura had just given a name to something I had witnessed hundreds of times. When we meet someone, we don't simply discover them, we partially invent them. Our imagination moves much faster and sadder than our eyes. A smile, one conversation, a certain way of looking at us. That's all our mind needs. It fills in the missing pieces. It invents virtues, softens flaws, writes an entire future, without ever asking reality for permission. And perhaps the strangest part is that we don't even realize we're doing it. We believe we've fallen in love with another human being, when in reality, we've also fallen in love with a version of that person created by our own expectations. That single idea began explaining countless breakups, not all of them, but many, because I realized that disappointment doesn't always appear when the other person changes. Sometimes it appears when they stop resembling the character. Well, a few weeks later, John came back. The moment he walked into my office, I noticed something had changed. He looked calmer, lighter. The wedding ring was no longer in his hand. It wasn't on his finger either. He had put it away, not because he had forgotten his marriage, but because for the first time, it no longer needed to define him. He sat down across from me, and for the first time since we'd met, he smiled. "Doctor, I think I've discovered something." I said nothing. Some discoveries deserve silence before they're spoken. He looked at the floor for a moment, then quietly said, "For months, I kept telling myself that my wife wasn't the same woman anymore. But now I'm beginning to wonder whether the woman I believed I'd lost ever really existed the way I remembered her." I didn't answer, because that conclusion wasn't mine. It was his, And the truths we discover for ourselves are the only ones that truly change our lives. John took a slow breath. Then he looked straight at me. Do you know what scares me now? I shook my head. I'm afraid that one day I'll fall in love again. And once again, I'll invent the person standing in front of me. His question lingered in the room. And in that moment, I realized we'd finally reached the real heart of the problem, and the challenge isn't learning how to survive a breakup. The challenge is learning to see another person without allowing our own desires to blind us, because perhaps the most mature form of love isn't finding someone perfect. It's having the courage to see another person exactly as they are and choosing to stay, not despite their imperfections, but sometimes because of them. At that moment, I remembered something my grandfather told me when I was a little boy. A sentence that took me more than 40 years to understand. He said, "Love begins the day imagination ends." Back then, I thought he was talking about disappointment. Today, I know he was talking about freedom, because imagination creates fantasy, but only reality allows two people to truly meet. If you've listened to John, to Sarah, to Mark, to Allison, and to Laura, perhaps your own thoughts have become a little clearer. Maybe you still don't have every answer. That's okay. No one does. But if during this journey, you've begun asking yourself better questions, then this video has already fulfilled its purpose. Because healing doesn't begin when we find all the answers. It begins the moment we stop asking the wrong questions. And before you leave, I'd like to ask you something. Which story felt most like your own? John's, Sarah's, Mark's, Allison's, or Laura's? Let me know in the comments. I read every one of them, and many of the stories I share here are born from the courage of people who decide to tell the truth. If this video helped you see your own story from a different perspective, consider subscribing. And if you'd like to help this message reach someone who may need it today, a simple like can make all the difference. Because sometimes one new idea is enough to change an entire life. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next story, unknowingly created in our own minds.